Hello everyone, I'm Nizzahon here for the Aether Hub, bringing you another one of my MTG top 10s. In this video, I'm going to talk about the top 10 horrors in Magic's history. Horror is an interesting creature type. It is a fairly common one. There are 193 horrors in total. That's a decent number. And it debuted not all the way back in Alpha, but in one of the first expansions in Legends was the first time we saw a horror. And horrors are interesting because they're sort of a catch-all creature type for scary-looking black creatures that aren't demons or zombies or something else. They're kind of impossible to describe. They're just so grotesque, usually, is why they're called horrors. And in fact, between 1995 and 2002, Magic tried to avoid using the demon creature type and instead used horror as a creature type because the idea of demons and things was sort of controversial in the mid-90s about Magic, and it got some bad publicity because of it. Eventually, demons came back, though, and horrors became a much less commonly used creature type, though we did just recently see a lot of them in Shadows over Innistrad block, where horrors weren't only black creatures, but also any sort of creature that was being corrupted by the Eldrazi influence. So we're going to see some of those horrors on this list. So I've actually done an MTG top 10 on horrors before over on my channel that you may have seen, but I did it a very long time ago, over a year ago, and I didn't have the methodology developed that I use now to make my top 10s. Some of the cards are the same, but most of them are not. So if you've seen that video, this is a new video. It has almost completely different cards on it because of different methodology and the new horrors that have come along in Magic. So speaking of my methodology, I'll remind you guys of how I make these top 10 lists, and then we'll get right into counting them. Cards receive points depending on how many Grand Prix or Pro Tour top 8s they've received, with a Pro Tour top 8 worth twice as much as a Grand Prix top 8. The cards in this list are ranked numbers 10 through 1, with the highest score being found at number 1. I also consider Legacy and Vintage Championship events as top 8s, Pro Tour top 8 specifically, so that those formats can be properly represented in the scores of these cards. Now let's get started. Before we start with this list, try your hand at guessing what horror comes in at number 1 on this list. At number 10, we have one of those horrors from Shadows over Innistrad block, one of 3 to make the list, and one of 3 cards on the list still in Standard, and this one is Loam Dryad. The Dryad was a great source of mana fixing and ramp, as on turn 2, it could get you to 3 mana, basically making it a bad Llanowar Elf since you had to play a creature on turn 2 and tap both it and the Dryad to make the mana. It only saw play in Standard, and its primary home there was in decks featuring Cryptolith Rite, which, in a way, made all of your creatures turn into mana dorks. This worked well with the Dryad because it was capable of being a mana dork already, and it could help you pump out creatures more quickly by helping you ramp, meaning you got to make more mana with Cryptolith Rite. These Cryptolith Rite decks managed one Pro Tour top 8 in the hands of Luis Scott Vargas at Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad in 2016, and decks similar to it, running Loam Dryad and Cryptolith Rite, put up 5 Grand Prix top 8s as well. While it had success during the early days of Shadows over Innistrad Standard, it was quickly pushed aside by decks focusing instead on the Delirium mechanic, and Loam Dryad hasn't seen play outside of the year 2016. It could always make a comeback, though, as it still has some time in Standard. At number 9, we have Shambling Swarm, a 4-mana 3/3 with a pretty weird text box. When it dies, it puts -1/-1 counters on things, which isn't too unusual, but the weird thing about it is that those counters only last a turn. I'm not sure there's another card in Magic that has -1/-1 counters that just appear at the end of turn, so it's a pretty unique card. Still, even though the counters only last a turn, this made it so that attacking into or effectively blocking Shambling Swarm was sort of a nightmare, as it could easily create 2-for-1s and even 4-for-1s in optimal situations. In the Odyssey block constructed Pro Tour Osaka in 2002, the Swarm managed 5 top 8s, 4 in mono-black control decks and 1 in a blue-black control deck. He was a good creature for those decks, as he was a major issue for aggro decks to get through, thanks to its ability to take down multiple creatures in a single combat and eventually help a control deck win through attrition. However, outside of block, it never saw play at the premier level again. At number 8, we have another horror that is a creature being corrupted by Eldrazi influence, and that is Gisela the Broken Blade. While her friend Bruna the Fading Light is also an angel horror, as is the creature they make when they fuse together to make Brazella, Gisela is the only one of the angel horrors to find her way onto this list, as she was good in decks that didn't include Bruna, whereas Bruna always needed Gisela to be at her best. Gisela is just an incredibly efficient creature, incredibly difficult to block or attack through thanks to flying and first strike, and she can provide 8 life of damage swing every turn thanks to lifelink and quickly end games. In addition to seeing play alongside Bruna in legendary Naya decks, she saw play in the blue-white flash decks that dominated Standard in the latter half of 2016, and more recently, she has made her way into a few Mardu Vehicles deck lists, including a deck that finished in the top 8 at Pro Tour Aether Revolt in February of 2017. She's also made one Grand Prix top 8 in Modern at Grand Prix Indianapolis in 2016, where she appeared in a Hate Bear deck. Seeing play in non-rotating formats is a good sign for Gisela, and it seems likely she finds her way into a few more standard decks before she rotates too, so she could end up moving up on this list in the near future. At number 7, we have Faceless Butcher. Torment was a set filled with horrors. In fact, the set symbol itself is a horror. There was a whole cycle of horrors who had abilities that exiled something when they came into play, and then returned it when they died. In Faceless Butcher's case, it has a Fiend Hunter effect, exiling a creature. Every time creatures with these abilities are printed, they seem to see at least a little bit of play, as developing your board with a body, in this case a 2/3, and getting rid of your opponent's best creature, all with a single card, is pretty great. The Butcher first saw play in block, putting up 2 top 8s alongside Shambling Swarm and black control decks there. The Butcher saw absolutely no play in Standard, though, but in Extended it did some work. It showed up in black-green rock decks, which were basically mid-range decks of the time, and in Reanimator decks, where getting the Butcher out of the graveyard to kill something was a nice thing to do, assuming you milled it into your graveyard and it sort of became part of your toolbox. And in the early game, it could just help you find a way to get your win condition in your graveyard while stalling your opponent. After 2003, the Butcher never saw play again, and it seems unlikely that it sees play in formats as powerful as Legacy and Vintage, but it still did enough during its time to be one of the best horrors ever. At number 6, we have our second Dryad horror on the list, interestingly, Gnarlwood Dryad. When we talked about Loam Dryad, I mentioned that Delirium strategies eventually pushed Loam Dryad out of black-green decks, but another Dryad filled in for it, Gnarlwood Dryad. Basically a Typhoid Rats with upside, it could not only trade with anything, but the Dryad also became a force to be reckoned with when you managed to get to Delirium, which these decks were very efficient at, becoming a 3/3. The Dryad saw play primarily in Golgari Delirium decks, but it also found its way into Collected Company decks, where flashing the Dryad into play to block could be pretty powerful. It hasn't seen play outside of Standard yet, but it has generated some buzz in Modern, and has started appearing in some versions of Death Shadow Zoo, even almost picking up a top 8 at Grand Prix Lille in 2016 in the deck, but only making it to the top 16. The Dryad still has time in Standard, and might even have what it takes for Modern, but time will tell. At number 5, we have Icarid. If you're wondering what the thing next to this card's name is, it's a tombstone. For a while there, Wizards started putting tombstone symbols on cards that could do stuff while they were in the graveyard. This included cards with flashback, but also included creatures who could come out of the graveyard. They did not do this for very long, but truth be told, I kind of like that just by looking at the name of this card, I know it does something in the graveyard. But anyway, back to Icarid. Icarid is an interesting card. One that when initially printed, people thought was terrible, and it kind of was. 4 mana for a 3/1 with haste that dies every turn, even with the ability to come back, was pretty bad. It did manage 1 Pro Tour top 8 and at a block Pro Tour in 2002, but this was sort of the exception that proves the rule. Icarid saw absolutely no play in Standard. There was no way to fill your graveyard enough to just keep bringing back Icarid until your opponent was dead. Then, one day, Wizards designed one of the most broken mechanics they've ever designed, Dredge, which debuted several years after Icarid was printed in Ravnica block. Today, we know Dredge decks are a force to be reckoned with, but Icarid is important in the history of Dredge decks because it was one of the very first decks that tried to abuse Dredge, and it showed up in the extended format, and that's where Icarid was legal. Icarid was one of the major win conditions, as bringing back 2 to 3 Icarids every turn wasn't actually all that difficult when you're dredging a ton every turn. Icarid made its first appearance at a premier event since 2002 at Grand Prix Vienna in 2008, and it was nothing short of dominant, putting up 4 top 8s and finishing with 10 decks in the top 32 of the event. Dredge is even stronger in Legacy and Vintage thanks to the presence of Lion's Eye Diamond, and Icarid has gone along for the ride in Dredge decks in those formats as well, some of which don't actually run any lands. They just run Lion's Eye Diamond, start dredging, and pull Icarids out of their graveyard for free until their opponent's dead. Icarid put up its last Vintage Championship in 2015, and Dredge decks featuring Icarid have not been as common of late, but I wouldn't count him out just yet. At number 4, we have Marek Fiend. Part of the same cycle as Faceless Butcher, the Fiend lets you disrupt your opponent's plans by exiling a card in their hand when it comes into play, and also gives you valuable information about your opponent's hand. It was featured in a lot of the same decks as Faceless Butcher and Shambling Swarm in block, putting up 4 top 8s at the Block Pro Tour Osaka in 2002 in black-based control decks. Like Faceless Butcher, it didn't see play in Standard, but it found its way into extended decks. This included aggressive black decks like Suicide Black, but also included Reanimator decks and black-green mid-range decks. The Fiend comboed particularly well with Cabal Therapy, because you knew it was in your opponent's hand, you wouldn't miss on your first or second time casting the Therapy, and that's a pretty big game. The Fiend's most recent top 8 came in 2009 in a black-green mid-range deck in Legacy, but it hasn't seen play since then. At number 3, we have Phyrexian Negator. A 3-mana 5/5 with Trample was insane at the time, and would still be good today, but back then it had to come with a pretty hefty downside, and the Negator does. you have to lose a permanent every time it takes 1 damage, and by that I mean 1 permanent for every 1 damage done to it. This means that your opponent can cast Lightning Bolt just to make you lose 3 permanents and not even want to kill the Negator. Still, the Negator was so ahead of the curve in terms of its stats that it found its way into competitive decks, usually decks packed with removal that can ensure the Negator was always getting in there for damage. In Standard, it picked up 2 top 8s at Worlds in 1999 in mono-black mid-range decks. It found the most success in Extended, though, where it put up 4 Pro Tour top 8s and 7 Grand Prix top 8s between 2000 and 2005. This included the aptly named Suicide Black deck, which ran a bunch of other cards that hurt you and had big downsides, but also included Reanimator and Black-Green mid-range decks. It saw some play in Legacy too, appearing in Hulk Flash at Grand Prix Columbus in 2007. So, after a string of cards with old card frames, we get to our first modern legal card in a while, Phyrexian Revoker. Revoker is a Pithing Needle on a stick, shutting down activated abilities of non-lands. Unlike Pithing Needle, it can actually name effects that are mana abilities, so this means naming mana rocks can shut them down. This makes the Revoker a nice sideboard card because it is so flexible, and there are so many problem-activated abilities around in multiple formats that are nice to shut down. It was printed originally and mirrored in Besieged, but reprinted in Magic 2015, so it did get 2 rides through Standard. The first time around, it saw some high finishes in Fauna Shaman and Tempered Steel decks, but versions of those decks running the Revoker never quite cracked a Premier Event top 8. Its second time through Standard, however, it did see play. Magic Origins included our first look at Kaladesh, which meant a bunch of cards that cared about artifacts were legal in Standard, and suddenly an artifact-centric deck was a possibility in Magic Origins. These decks ran cards like Insoul Artifact and Shrapnel Blast and basically wanted to cram as many artifacts as possible into the deck. Phyrexian Revoker was one of them, and it didn't hurt that he could shut down opposing Hangerback Walkers and the like. The Revoker managed 3 top 8s at Pro Tour Magic Origins in 2015, but it has done the most in non-rotating formats. In Modern, it only recently started seeing play after the printing of Collected Company, and has managed to pick up a few Grand Prix top 8s and Collected Company decks there. However, Magic's most powerful formats, Legacy and Vintage, are where Phyrexian Revoker is most at home. Being able to shut down opposing mana rocks and other powerful permanents with activated abilities is great. In Legacy, this has primarily included Death and Taxes decks that run a lot of 2-drop creatures who disrupt your opponent's plans, and that is certainly what the Revoker aims to do. In Vintage, the Revoker has found its way into Mud decks, which are basically mono artifact decks, and has put up 2 Vintage Championship top 8s in that deck. Now, let's move to the number 1 card in this list, which outscores every other horror on this list by more than 100 points, and will likely remain the number 1 horror in Magic's history forever, and that is Spellskite, which has finished number 1 on 2 other top 10 lists too. Artifacts, meaning an entire card type, it finished number 1, so that shows you, in general, it has one of the highest scores in the entire game, using my method, and it also finished number 1 in 0 power creatures. And so now it can add a 3rd MTG Top 10 number 1 appearance to its record. Spellskite is great because it stops such a wide variety of strategies. You can use it just to redirect removal spells so that you can protect your primary threat, but where it really shines is against a deck like Infect, which it faced in multiple formats, where Spellskite is pretty much game over, since the person with the Spellskite in play can just redirect all the pump spells that would go towards Infect creatures. It also saw a lot of play in Modern during the era of Splinter Twin, where Spellskite could easily break up the combo, and because it was also a good against Infect, which was also there, while also providing a bolt-proof body. It has seen and continues to see a lot of play in Modern. If I told you every single deck that this has managed a Modern top 8 in, we would be here for a pretty long time, since the fact that it is colorless means that anyone can sideboard it, and they often do. That does it for this MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to click the like button. If you want to catch more of my Top 10s, I post them here and over on my channel, Nizzahon Magic. You can subscribe to both channels to see all of my Top 10s. You can also find a lot of other great content here by other MTG content creators. In the comments, give me some ideas for future Top 10s. Thanks for watching.
Hey guys, thanks for watching the Aether Hub here on YouTube. If you enjoyed this video, support the channel and all our creators by liking, sharing, and of course subscribing so you never miss our latest video. You yourself can become an honorary Hub member by visiting our store at www.aetherhubtcg.com. We have a special pre-order event happening right now where you can snag some of the best deals on packs available. Afterwards, consider visiting our friends over at 5 Color Combo. They have an amazing free app that I use to practice my limited picking skills along with custom art playmats and tokens. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, never be afraid to feed your obsession. I'll see you guys next time.